Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Natalia De Esteban. I'm the EMCC UK Knowledge Exchange Director, and I am delighted to be able to host a climate and coaching webinar, the first of a series of 5 that we are delighted to host. And I really emphasize this with my deepest thanks to Zoe and the colleagues that are going to be doing this for us in the next few months. This is a recorded webinar. We're going to be sharing it as an open, free resource, and this means all of you, your friends, even your family can have access to this if they so wish, in that this is not restricted to EMCC members. We appreciate this is a very important topic, and we wanted to commit to both the topic and to the profession of coaching and supervision and mentoring by offering this as a free resource. So thank you, Zoe, not just for your time today, but in orchestrating this series and for the amazing resources that you facilitated. And all of these can be found, again, as an open resource in the EMCC UK website. So my role here is just to host and to be able to capture any questions, statements that you have through the chat, perhaps. So we will be saying more about that. And perhaps just to flag for continuity that we're going to have one of these going every month, and that so it's going to give us a few more details. So without further ado, I'm going to say thanks, Zoe, and over to you. And I'm disappearing in the background, so see you all a little bit later on.
Thank you so much, Natalia. I really appreciate your introduction, and I do want to say a sincere thank you to Natalia and EMCC colleagues for their fantastic support for myself and for this series of webinars that myself and colleagues will be running over the next 5 months, this being the first of 5. I thank you for joining us from wherever you are. Massive appreciation, and I do sit here feeling really very humbled that coaches from across the world are joining to be part of this conversation. And I join you and sit here not in any enormous expertise, other than I'm on my journey with this, I think, like a number of us, and I'm sharing with you my my own truths and my own discoveries about myself and my work here. And I'm humbled by your joining me in this conversation. As a coach, like many, if not all of us, we like to actually engage with people and have conversations. But for this format, for this particular session, it is mostly me talking at you, for which I apologise. But I look forward to getting comments and questions in the chat. So feel free to ask comments and questions at any time. There will be 2 or 3 pauses during this session and I'll ask Natalia's help to feed in comments and questions at those times, but feel free to have access to that chat space at any point, basically. Okay, so coaching in a changing climate. Well, I'm imagining all of you, having joined this conversation or this call, know that the climate is certainly changing. And I just want to say a moment about really what led me to be here having this conversation, exploring this with you today. So back at the end of 2018 and beginning of 2019, I was very much exploring and how I could make the most impact in the rest of my life in many, many different ways. And it felt like being a coach and being part of a community of professional coaches was one of the ways that I could seek to make a difference. And what I'm going to share with you today, and the model that I've developed about how to be a climate conscious coach, is really came out of my own exploration and my own working on actually what could I do and how could I make the most difference. So this is kind of part of that work and part of my own progress about trying to make a difference in the world. So thank you for joining me in that conversation. So without further ado, there we are. Okay, so what brings me here today? Well, I've given you a little bit of information on that. One of the many things that motivates me to work and act in respect of climate change and the climate and ecological crisis is being a mum. So I can't put an up-to-date picture of my daughter on here because she would never forgive me. So this is my daughter's scan picture at 20 weeks. She's nearly 17 now, and she's just as beautiful. So she is a large part of what motivates me to take action on climate and ecology for her and for the future of other mothers and fathers and their children and other species. So just before we get into the full extent of the information to share, I just really invite each of us, all of us on this call, to just perhaps, get into a grounded state of mind and grounded position, whether that involves you shifting in your chair, grounding your feet flat on the floor, sitting up straight and feeling yourself in your presence in the here and now. And perhaps invite you to close your eyes and take 1 or 2 deep breaths and just connect with being here, and also connect with what's brought you to this conversation, what's brought you to this webinar on this day, and motivated you to be part of this work that we're in together. If you want to share that, feel free, or if you want to write it down in your own reflection, or just note it in your own mind and heart. And connect with our presence and our purpose today. Broadly, this session is going to be in 2 parts, but the parts will blur a bit. Part 1 is going to focus on the science and what the science tells us, and part 2 is going to be more about actually what can we do as climate conscious coaches, but it is going to blur a little bit. So I wanted to just start with sharing my 9 domains of my climate conscious coach model. And as I said, I really just came up with this initially out of my own reflections about thinking about how I could make a difference as a coach, as part of my humanity. Through this session, we're going to be touching on all of these 9 domains. So I'm not going to go into each of them right now. We're going to do that as we go through the session. But I will start on the left-hand side at the sort of 9 o'clock position with the first place. And we know as coaches with ourselves and with our clients that, all insight and change needs to start with ourselves, doesn't it? It can't really start anywhere else. And I don't see it as any different in terms of our journey to working on our climate consciousness and climate action. It needs to start with ourselves. So with that in mind, here are some questions. Obviously as coaches, we like questions and we like to ask questions and reflect on questions. So I've taken these questions from, or adapted them from the article that I wrote that was published in the Association for Coaching Perspectives magazine last month, January it came out. There is a link there on the screen, which I'm sure can be shared if that's of interest. So thinking about this first domain of ourselves, for me, that really is made up of a couple of different areas. So it's about growing our awareness of the reality that we find ourselves in, which is about educating and informing ourselves about the science and the realities of what is changing in the world and human impacts, and how can we play our fullest part in what is going to unfold in the next stage of human history. And as well as that, informing ourselves and educating ourselves, there is also the work on ourselves in terms of our own awakening and grief cycle, or whatever you like to call it from your practice. For me, the self is very much about both that education and understanding and information, and working with ourselves as humans, as individuals, as heart and head and hands, and understanding where are we on the cycle of really awakening to what's happening, and the levels of denial, the grief, the anger, the blame, etc. And how can we support ourselves ultimately to move through that, to take responsibility and to act, and to be part of these early stages of this shifting of collective human consciousness to bring about the change that is needed for ourselves our children, the future generations, and for the rest of life on Earth. And that might all sound really, really big at this point in the conversation, given we've only been going for a short period of time, but hopefully this will all unfold. So this next biggest part of this session is really speaking to this first domain of raising our awareness and helping us all to be on a shared, starting point of a shared understanding of the core of the essence of the problem and the science. So, without further ado, so I'm going to hopefully start from the beginning, really, thinking about carbon emissions and climate change, starting at that point. So I am sure that many of you are familiar with carbon dioxide, or CO2, as you can see here. Sorry, apologies, turned too quick. I must remember not to click when I didn't mean to click. You'll be familiar with carbon dioxide being one of the main, if not the main, greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. So what I'm sharing here is the real scientific data on levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over time. And you can see this chart on the left starts from approximately 1650, 1700, so before the Industrial Revolution, and that the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that is measured in parts per million was pretty static and stable at about 280 parts per million thereabouts for hundreds of years, in fact longer than that, much longer than that, leading up to this situation, and then gradually began to increase with the Industrial Revolution, 1800s, 1850 onwards. And then, as you can see from really that Second World War and post-war period, there's been huge increase in CO2 and carbon dioxide levels. And this picture on the right-hand side begins in the 1950s, which is basically this bit of the chart expanded. And these are measurements at the Mauna Loa Observatory, which measure daily carbon dioxide measurement. So the heading is the latest reading on the internet available from 2 days ago. And we are at a record-breaking 413.69 parts per million. The level that was deemed to be safe by scientists, safe for atmospheric, planetary and climate conditions, is deemed to be around 300 to 350 parts per million, which we passed in the 1980s. So we're a long way from safe. And what's been known for a long time, in well over 100 years, scientists have known that when you increase the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you increase the temperature, because it's a greenhouse gas, therefore it traps the sun's rays and like a blanket around the Earth. So we've been thickening the blanket around the Earth, and that's been trapping the sun's energy in the atmosphere. So the average global temperature has been increasing, as you can see on this chart. So this chart is relative mean global temperature increases over time from 1850 to more or less the present day, or nearly the present day. And you can see there are two lines. So we have this dark line. The darker line is the land and ocean mean surface temperature, and the grey line is just the land temperature average, not the land and ocean. So I'm highlighting this for three reasons. One, to show how the temperature has been increasing across the surface of the Earth. Also to highlight that if you're familiar from reading articles in the press and so on, or scientific papers that talk about 1 degree rise, 2 degree rise, etc., this is what they're talking about. They're talking about this land ocean mean surface temperature increase, and we're at about 1.1 degrees approximately at the moment. So that's what this dark line is. Excuse me. This grey line is referring to the land increase only. Now, it's here because it's significant, because of course we're land-dwelling creatures. We don't live in the sea, we live on land. So you can see that the average global temperature on land is increasing significantly faster than it is on average across the whole of the Earth's surface. So it's quite, these are mean temperature increases, so that hides a lot of variation. Within, it's also easy to think about what does that actually mean? Why is small numbers like 1 degree, 2 degrees, why are they a big issue? Well, this is an extract from, as you can see, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, his speech when he launched the IPCC report in autumn 2018. The IPCC being the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the gathering of leading scientists who pull together the global consensus on the climate science. In launching this, you can see, I'm sure I don't need to read the whole thing out, you can see what's there. And Antonio Guterres directly made clear that we are facing a direct existential threat. And I've emboldened that bit of text. And also that what we still lack, even after the Paris Agreement in 2015, is the leadership and ambition to do what is needed. So the report that came out in autumn 2018, you may be familiar with that one. It kind of, the headline got summarized to saying that we have 12 years to save the planet, you know, words along that line, along those lines. And of course, now we have lost a further 18 months, so we have just over 10 years based on this Paris Agreement report, but on the report in 2018, which basically said that whilst the Paris Agreement was a voluntary commitment for governments to act to keep temperatures below a 2 degree increase, actually the science is telling us that what we need to do is keep to below 1.5 degrees, if that is at all possible, because we do face this direct existential threat, and human civilization is going to suffer catastrophic consequences if we do not limit warming, and every fraction of every degree matters. So unfortunately, whilst the IPCC and others have been saying this for quite some time, unfortunately action is not yet at the level that it's needed by any means, and CO2 is still rising year on year. I wanted to share this animation, which is taken from NASA data, so it's published and credible science. If you may or may not have seen it before, but as you can see, it's global temperature anomalies from 1880, so kind of early stages of the Industrial Revolution, relatively, through to 2017. And as you can see it scrolling through, you can see the dates in the middle, they just keep on scrolling, and the blue and the white give way to yellow and to orange, and then increasingly to those red and dark red patches. So I wanted to share this with you because it shows how those what sound like quite glib numbers, like 1 degree, 2 degree mean average surface temperature rises, what they actually hide is huge variation across the surface of the Earth. And you can see as this keeps scrolling forward that the temperature increases across the planet have not been evenly felt. What strikes you perhaps most if you look at the latter parts of this animation is that warming is particularly concentrated in the northern the Arctic, and to a lesser degree in the Antarctic. So the poles are warming at least 3 times faster than the rest of the planet. And that is an issue for several reasons. I'm sure you'll be familiar with the sea level rise issue because of melting Arctic and Antarctic ice, which is melting at a level which is faster than scientists thought it would be and predicted it would be. But as well as sea level rise, what is also really important is that the temperature gradient between the equator and the poles is an important part of actually holding our weather systems in the relatively predictable pattern that they have been in here historically. And unfortunately, through our actions of causing this enormous amount of global heating, which perhaps is more accurately caused as climate breakdown, because it is breaking down the climate system, and the differentials in temperature between the equator and the poles that are reducing are meaning that the wind systems and the ocean currents are all being affected and are breaking down their predictable patterns, which is why not everything we see accompanied with global heating is actually things getting hotter. You can have blasts of what should be Arctic cold air below the Arctic, and you can have extreme heat in the Arctic and Antarctic. So the climate is literally breaking down. So what's the trajectory that we're on? So you'll see that in a lot of these cases, I've provided the links or the sources of this information so that you can see where you can get it from. Climate Action Tracker is a well-known and acknowledged site for emissions and country by country information based on what governments have publicly committed to do. So what this is saying that you can see dates along the bottom and total greenhouse gas emissions at the side in gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent year on year. That the grey wedge, which is the business as usual, which is really basically where governments and corporations and consumer behaviour, you know, all the totality of all of that, where that is taking us. And it's taking us by 2100, a date at which my daughter, if she was still alive, would be 97. It's taking us to a world in which there is global average heating of between 4.1 and 4.8 degrees. So another 3 to 4 degrees hotter on average than we are now. That might not sound a lot, but there it is acknowledged by significant numbers of scientists. For example, Professor Kevin Anderson of the Tyndall Centre, which is one of the leading climate science centres, he is on record talking about a 4-degree world being one in which it's not compatible with modern human civilization, and difficult to imagine that we actually could survive that in any meaningful way. If you want to know more in more detail about how these things could unfold in a world that is heading in that direction, then I thoroughly recommend a number of books, one of which is called The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells. It's a challenging book, but it's definitely worth reading. So this is where business as usual is taking us. Government policies, stated policies are taking us to a world that's sort of 2.8 to 3 degrees, which is still difficult to imagine, quite frankly, given what you, no doubt you've already seen in the media and may have already directly or indirectly experienced in terms of climate actions and consequences. And you can see by contrast, you know, the IPCC report in 2018 says we need to do whatever we can to stay below 1.5 degrees. And what that needs is a trajectory that is, you know, almost diametrically opposed from where we are. I've got a number of charts in here. If you don't like charts, I do apologise. I hope I can explain them all. I've included some of them here to sort of try and address a number of the common questions that come up about the climate science, just so that we can hopefully all be clear about these. So as some of you may know, I do a lot of sharing on LinkedIn on these related subjects, and I do get all sorts of questions and challenges, and I get trolled and so on, but which is fine. That's just the nature of things. But people do have reasonable questions about actually what is causing this. Well, this is a chart from Carbon Brief, another well-known and respected source of data and analysis that shows, you can see the different human and natural factors from 1850 to nearly the present day, and the part that they've played on either decreasing or increasing global average temperature. And this red line, which is clearly by far the one that tracks the actual, is greenhouse gases. And these natural factors that sometimes people talk about, like solar, the solar cycles of the relative heats, etc., from the sun, we can see that has almost no difference at all relatively. And there are other impacts like volcanic activity that are, if anything, cooling rather than warming the atmosphere. And it's really clear to see that in total it is human factors that are playing the part, and by far the largest is, of course, greenhouse gases. So again, just to kind of exemplify and explain a little bit more about actually why what sound like small numbers are actually big issues. This is a chart taken from a fairly recent report by McKinsey, just trying to provide a whole range of different sources here. So you can see that so many different organisations and bodies in not just in the research world, but also in the leadership and consulting world are also now talking more and more about this stuff, which is kind of good. That what this chart is talking about is Northern Hemisphere summer temperatures. So I know that some of us on this call are in the Northern Hemisphere. I think some people may be in the Southern Hemisphere, but there are similar but different data for the Southern Hemisphere, I believe. But what this is showing is that starting on the left-hand side, you have frequency charts for average summer temperatures. So you've got like a bell curve, and then you've got overlaid bell curves for each time period. And a way to think about this in a human way for me is thinking about it as a generational thing and what each generation is experiencing. So my mum was born in 1935, bless her. So that's the first temperature distribution. So the summers my mum knew were this distribution here, with average or slightly cooler summers, but a normal distribution. And then as each generation has gone by, so I was born in 1970, so on this third blue distribution, the summers that I experienced were not the same summers that my mum experienced. And then this latest black distribution is the summers that my daughter will remember and that she grew up in. And you can see, actually, even in that period of time, when global average heating will have been less than 1 degree average increase between there and there, actually the difference in distribution is looks like 2 to 3 standard deviations of increase in average summer temperatures, which means that we have moved out of what we were used to, what we were all brought up in. Our children are not brought up in the same climate that we were brought up in. And this is only going one way. It's only going one way for a number of reasons, one of which is that carbon dioxide lasts for hundreds, if not thousands of years in the atmosphere. And the extremities of heat, which are getting more and more frequent, of course, cause problems for human health and animal and plant health and many, many other issues. One more chart. This is a set of charts again from that same McKinsey report. What this is really just saying, you don't need to necessarily worry about all the detail, but it's basically saying that in natural systems, a whole range of different types of natural systems, change can soon become non-linear when thresholds are crossed. So just two that I'd bring your attention to as examples. Here is impact of heat on outdoor labour. So humans' ability to work outside dependent on the heat. And you can see as temperature increases, basically humans are not able to work outside anymore past a certain temperature. Wet bulb temperature is about having very, very high or total humidity at the same time as having outdoor temperature increases. So our bodies are not built for that. We're not adapted for that. We can't cool down. So we become unable to actually work outdoors, whether that is, building work or farm labouring, agricultural, etc., etc. And another example in the bottom right-hand corner is crop yields. So as temperature increases, you do actually get some increases in crop yields because of plants being able to metabolize faster, etc. But then past a certain point, the yield then crashes. So you do get these non-linear changes happening. And unfortunately, more information from Climate Action Tracker, global progress is stalling in terms of the increases, for example, in renewables. So renewables were increasing, they are still increasing, but so far the increase in renewable energy has been more than outstripped by additions in fossil fuel usage. So it's not going in the right direction. And some more information here about how it's not going in the right direction. I find this one of the most striking pictures, to be honest, which is why I share it with yourselves and with others. It's Climate Action Tracker data from last summer. I think further updates are available, although things haven't changed massively. And what this is a country by country or region by region summary of government's commitments against the Paris Agreement targets. So that goal of seeking to limit emissions to keep us at a 2 degree target and ideally a 1.5 degree rise. So you can see that that role model of staying well below 1.5 degrees, there are no countries that are planning to do that on their current trajectory. And there are only 2 countries who are actually acting as if we need to stay below 1.5 degrees. Everyone else in the world, which is pretty much everyone, every other government are not behaving in the way that we, their citizens, need them to. So I would stress here, this is not about party politics. This is just the science. This is just what the data is telling us. And you can see on this kind of indicator here that, you know, the science tells us that we need to stay below 1.5 degrees if at all possible, although actually that's looking very doubtful now because of the extent of lack of action, and that there are major parts of the world where governments are clearly failing to act in a way that's needed. So I'm conscious that people on this call are from many different parts of the world potentially. I'm sat in the UK at the moment, and we're included, for the purposes of this, we're included in the EU. I presume they'll separate us out at some point in these charts, but they haven't done yet. And so the way that the EU is acting, and as are these other countries, they are taking us to a world which is somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees, which is not compatible with very much agriculture, never mind civilization, as far as I understand it from the science. So I hope that gives you a sense of some of the reasons why I feel this the way that I do. What I'd also like to give you a sense of is cumulative emissions, because, as I said, carbon dioxide lasts for hundreds, if not thousands of years in the atmosphere. So actually what matters is not just what we're emitting now, that is obviously incredibly important, but what we've already emitted historically. And there's also a moral and ethical aspect to this, because conscious being in the United Kingdom, you know, it's where in the UK we started the Industrial Revolution and started burning all this coal and oil and gas. And if you wind back to 1750, that this left-hand side chart shows you, actually in 1750 the UK was by far the biggest global emitter, with others being fractionally tiny. And if you wind forward to 2018, cumulatively, the UK is actually the 5th biggest emitter. So while some people say, for example, that the UK is a small country and actually we're doing really well, it's not as simple as that, because cumulative emissions are incredibly important. And yes, other countries matter and what they do matters, but actually what every country does matters, because it's a zero-sum game, you know, if we don't all act on this. So cumulative emissions really matter. And it's also worth mentioning that the way that governments count their carbon emissions, certainly from the UK point of view, but I think other countries do this as well. They don't account for aviation and shipping. So quite who does, I don't know, but it's not counted certainly in the government's measures of emissions in the UK, nor do they count consumption emissions based on what's imported and exported. So if you do include those, for example, in the UK's emissions, it more than doubles them, I understand. And it also demonstrates that whilst this country likes to talk about how well it's doing and it's leading carbon reduction globally, that's actually not really true. We're doing a lot less well than the government would like to think we are. I'm not making that as a political statement, it literally is just the science, because of the way that things are currently counted. But you can't fool Mother Nature. It's like if you're on a diet and you eat some chocolate, you know, your diet still knows that you've eaten chocolate, and Mother Nature still knows that we've consumed fossil fuels and put them out in the atmosphere. So whether the governments report on them or not, it doesn't make any difference. They're still in the atmosphere and they're still causing warming. So another common kind of question, or sometimes challenge that is put to the climate data is, well, hang on a minute, hasn't the climate always been changing? So this is just a natural change, isn't it? It's not a big deal, let's just go back to normal. Well, kinda. So yes, the climate has always been changing, but it's not quite as simple as that. So this is why I include this chart, which might look quite complicated, but I will explain it and I hope it makes sense. So along the bottom, we have time, and at the side we have relative change of temperature compared with a kind of 1960 to 1990 average. So along the bottom, it's not a linear scale, I'm sure you've already seen that. It's a kind of condensed scale, a bit like a log scale, if you're familiar with that, but don't worry if not. So we've got, starting on the left-hand side, we've got hundreds of millions of years, tens of millions of years, millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years, and thousands of years. So effectively, if this whole chart was all on the same scale as the right-hand side, it would be a massive long chart that would go all around the room that you're in several times. So we condense it all up so you can see it on one slide. And what it shows, of course, is that the climate has changed. Yes, of course it has, but humans weren't here for most of it. So modern humans evolved about here, about 300,000 years ago. So you can see that all the previous variations of having a much hotter and colder planet at different times in the planet's life, we didn't exist then. So we're doing this giant experiment on ourselves. And as a species, we've evolved to cope better with cold than we have with heat. We're not actually a creature that's evolved to cope with a lot of heat. What this chart also shows is or links to is the previous mass extinctions on Earth. So there have been at least 5 mass extinctions before the one that we're now currently causing. And one of them is indicated by this peak, the Permian mass extinction, when you can see this huge temperature increase. And that's sometimes called the mother of all extinctions, when about 98% of all life on Earth died out because of these atmospheric and other changes. They, all but one of the previous mass extinctions were brought about by temperature increases as a result of volcanic activity, increasing the greenhouse gases and causing global heating, but obviously causing that naturally, as opposed to the global heating that we're now causing as humans. Of course, we are here, we exist as a species because of the small number of species that were able to survive these extinctions. And they were able to do that in part because these extinctions happened much, much slower than we are causing them now. So because these timescale is over hundreds of millions of years, these things happened at a speed where at least some species could adapt or move to parts of the Earth that they could survive. And then that allowed us and all the other species on Earth now to evolve from. Probably the most important point in the context of all of that on this chart is bringing your attention to the right-hand side and this very stable piece that's called the Holocene, which is the last 12,000 years, which in geological time is obviously a blink of an eye, but nonetheless in human time is pretty much all of modern human history and beyond. So what you can see there is enormous stability of temperature and climate for the last 12,000 years. And what that stability has enabled is a stable climate, meaning reasonably predictable weather, meaning that we've been able to have agriculture and therefore have villages and towns and cities and population increase and technology and supermarkets and mobile phones and laptops, and everything that we know in modern society has basically been enabled by this stable climate. So if you look around you in whatever room or facility that you're in right now, everything that you're touching and seeing has been enabled by this 12,000 years of stability. And if you may be able to see on the screen, at the very far right-hand side, there's this little tiny blue line, this little uptick in temperature that we are voluntarily and now knowingly taking ourselves out of the Holocene. We're taking ourselves out of this stability. And we're now in a period that scientists call the Anthropocene, the geological age of man, because we're on a one-way ticket to a different world at the moment. So how quickly do we need to reduce emissions and to create change? Well, you've probably already got a sense from this so far that we need to do an awful lot very, very quickly. But I share this chart with you to give you another sort of hopeful sense of what's called carbon budgets. So again, there is time along the bottom of this chart from 1980 to 2100, and then levels of emissions up the side in gigatons of carbon dioxide. And you'll see at the top, this is called a CO2 mitigation curve. But just by way of background to this, it's very clever scientists, much cleverer than myself, not being a climate scientist, are able to use the science to calculate literally the budget. So it's a bit like having a household budget that you can afford to spend. climate scientists work out how much more emissions, in other words, how much more fossil fuels can we afford to burn in order to keep the planet below a certain level of temperature increase. So, and they can then do that based on certain probabilities. So for certain probabilities of staying below, so you'll notice this isn't 100% probability. At best, this is a 2/3 probability of an opportunity to stay below 1.5 degrees. And we're already at 1.1. So this does not give anyone a firm, positive chance of anything. It's just the best that might be able to be sought, possibly at the moment. But you'll see on this chart that, as it says here, if we'd started to mitigate, if we'd started to take this seriously 20 years ago in the year 2000 and to reduce our emissions at 4% a year, we'd have been able to have this relatively gentle curve, relatively. But of course, unfortunately and tragically, we didn't take it seriously. We didn't listen to the scientists and we didn't heed their warnings, and emissions kept on going up and up and up. So we are where we are here, and we've almost used our carbon budget up, which means that we need to have these very rapid reductions in carbon emissions. We need to get you can see that's 2050. So the UK government, for example, has this net zero 2050 target, which means a lot more action than is currently being taken. And most scientists would say that that was actually too slow anyway. I know that Greta Thunberg rightly talks about the IPCC data and carbon budgets not factoring in the aspect of equity, so that governments are not, Northern Hemisphere governments are not planning to reduce their emissions in a way that would enable more carbon budget for poorer countries to be able to improve the lives of their own citizens. So equity is a huge issue in this, but I haven't got time to go into it in more depth. But hopefully you can see from this chart that actually we need to do a lot very quickly. It is the most urgent challenge that humanity's ever faced. And just as a reminder, you know, whilst all of this is going on, emissions are still increasing. As if that wasn't bad enough, guys, I'm afraid there is more to share, which I don't like to do, but unfortunately it isn't only ethical to share the full truth, really, that there are these things called feedback loops. You may have already heard that expression. The Earth's natural systems has a number of feedback loops. Here's just a couple of examples. On the left-hand side, we've got the melting of Arctic ice. And this involves something called the albedo effect, which you may remember learning at school, but don't worry if you didn't. We all do different syllabuses and different learnings and have different school experiences, so don't worry about that. But basically, the most simplest way of putting it is it's like the colour of t-shirt you wear on a hot sunny day. If you wear a dark coloured t-shirt, you'll get hotter. If you wear a white t-shirt, you won't get quite so hot. And the ice at the poles is like the Earth's white t-shirt. It reflects some of the sun's energy back out to space. And of course, we have, because of our actions, been melting large amounts of the ice at the poles. So what that does is reveal more dark sea surface, and dark sea surface absorbs more of the sun's heat and then radiates it back out into the atmosphere, which in turn melts more ice. So you can see that's a feedback loop. Similarly, another feedback loop is methane release from permafrost. Permafrost is the frozen land near the poles, near the Arctic, and that frozen land contains organic matter. And when it defrosts, the methane from the rotting organic matter can be released into the atmosphere as opposed to being trapped in the ice. And methane is an important greenhouse gas. It's a very powerful greenhouse gas. It has a much stronger warming effect, like a real sort of pump of warming, but it doesn't last as long as carbon dioxide. So it has a different action, but it's a very strong, impactful greenhouse gas. And you can see videos, online of scientists lighting streams of methane bubbling up from what would have been frozen lakes, etc. Scientists believe that all of these different feedback loops interact with each other and can cause effectively a domino effect, or what's called a tipping cascade. And a paper outlining a scenario called Hothouse Earth was published in 2018, in which some scientists put forward a view from the science that at somewhere around 2-degree average heating, that enough of these tipping points would have knock-on effects on each other and go into a tipping cascade such that we'd get into a hothouse Earth scenario. And what that means is a situation where these feedback loops tip over into being self-fulfilling, and they drive the activity themselves. So regardless of what mitigation humans would take, it wouldn't make any difference. Which sounds and is indeed scary. An update on that was a paper published in the very well thought of science journal Nature back in November last year, so a more recent paper where some of the world's leading scientists identified that a number of the tipping points in the Earth's systems, whether that's in ocean currents or permafrost thawing or Amazon deforestation and drought, that they can tell from the evidence that a number, as it says here, a number of those tipping points are active, and the domino effect, it basically backs their view that these things are connected, and the tipping points are beginning to be active. So as you can see from the subheading here, that's the growing threat of abrupt and irreversible climate change must compel political and economic action. So it's unfortunately back to the same story of, we know the science and we actually know what action to take, we're just not taking it. And so I think that's enough of the graphs. So where that takes us to, and I'm mindful of the time, that to make sure that we have some time for questions, as well as to get onto what we can actually do about this piece, is I'm imagining that many of you will be aware of some of the climate impacts already being felt around the world. You know, up till fairly recently, I think many people, and unfortunately some people still do, see climate change and climate breakdown, as we should call it, as something that is distant, is a long way away, and it affects other people who live differently from us. I'm afraid all of that is wrong, because it's here now and it's affecting every continent and every part of the world. So this is just a tiny, tiny sample of the climate impacts that have been felt in the last year or so. This top left is Queensland, Australia, not the current season, but last year's summer, where they had extreme droughts followed by floods, and 500,000 cattle died in one fell swoop. This is the California wildfires in Paradise, which were devastating, but a tiny, tiny scale of what's happened since in Australia. This middle one up here is Chennai, which is the 6th biggest city in India. There's 11 million people live in that city, and last summer the city ran out of water, completely ran out of water, which is an astonishing thing to even vocalize. But they had to have water trained and bussed into the city. As I understand it, that's just one of, first of a number of cities and areas in that part of India and Pakistan that are suffering extreme water shortages. And of course, there are other places in the world that are in that situation or heading that way. Down here in the bottom, we have Mozambique. Millions of people suffered from Hurricane Idai, followed by Hurricane Kenneth, 2 severe hurricanes, one after the other, last February. Up here, of course, we have the Australian wildfires that have burnt an area bigger than the whole geographical area of England. I think it may even be bigger than that now, but certainly the whole area of England has just been torched by the wildfires. More than a billion animals annihilated as a result of that, and that iconic picture of, in this case, this young girl and her family escaping the fires on boat into the sea. And then I also wanted to draw your attention in the bottom right-hand corner to some of the less communicated impacts. They get less media attention, certain impacts, and people don't make so much direct link to climate. But some of you may be aware at the moment, parts of East Africa are experiencing absolutely horrific locust swarms, the likes of which haven't been seen for 50 to 70 years, where literally billions, if not trillions, of locusts have arisen out of extreme weather conditions. in certain parts of the world, which has enabled them to have these extreme breeding and in the numbers that just never normally get seen, and they're decimating crops, and they're heading, it's heading towards serious food shortages and starvation, potentially affecting many millions of people if their lives weren't already hard enough as it is. So it's here, it's global, it's right now, and it's everywhere. And from a selfish point of view, sat in the UK, so if you're not in the UK, I apologise for this UK-centric slide. I'm sure in your own countries you can identify your equivalents, which may well be much worse. So again, my sincere empathy for that. But even in the UK, people like to think perhaps that it's not affecting us, but I hope that certainly the horrific floods that we've experienced in the last few weeks will have changed more and more people's minds. But there are more examples here on this slide of the impacts that we've had in recent years. So UK and Europe had an extreme heat wave in 2003. I can remember that. It was the year my daughter was born, so I do remember that. But actually we've had more and more heat waves since, haven't we? We've had record-breaking summers in 2018 and 2019 in the UK and many other European cities and countries. Here we've had the wettest February ever on record and the most flood warnings ever on record in this country, and there are thousands of people struggling right now with the business impacts of that, and the practical impacts and the mental and emotional impacts. There are increasing numbers of coastal communities being affected. There are whole villages that are going to be decommissioned because of sea level rise, health impacts, healthcare impacts, and something that's also really close to my heart is food and agriculture, and farmers are being impacted around the world, including in the UK and Europe. So, and I include this slide because it's often not the nature of the sort of science, and again, I'm not a climate scientist in any means, but the nature of things that are not often clearly understood, and certainly not often clearly explained in the media yet, unfortunately, that there are things, for example, called thermal lag. And thermal lag is due to the fact that when we pump out emissions, they don't immediately have their full warming effect. So the full warming effect of what we are emitting right now through all of our activities as humans will not be felt for somewhere between 10 and 30 years. So even if I was able to wave a magic wand, and I would dearly love to be able to do that, wave a magic wand and stop all emissions now, the warming effect would continue for decades. So which is why when I talk about these things, I use the analogy of being a super tanker. So when you put the brakes on a super tanker, it takes a long time to stop. And that's exactly the same with global heating as a result of what we are doing with emissions from fossil fuels and other causes, for example, deforestation, wildfires, etc. So even after emissions peak, as you can see here, it takes a long time for CO2 levels to actually stabilize, and for temperature takes even longer to stabilize. And then the Earth systems, they have their own momentum because of the physics and biology and chemistry of them. So sea level rise would continue, and ice melt, etc. would continue, and it would take a long time to stabilize. So we need to take extraordinary action and continue that extraordinary action for a long period of time. Although, of course, many of the actions that we need to take actually improve human health and well-being, whether that's cleaner air and reduced pollution, cleaner food, more natural ways of living, more active exercise and active travel, etc., etc. So, as I've alluded to, because of thermal lag and the scale of the planetary systems, the impacts of global heating and climate breakdown, even if we manage to get to net zero as quickly as possible, we will still feel the impacts of all of this getting worse over time for decades before it starts to significantly improve. That doesn't mean we shouldn't take action, far from it. Of course, we should do absolutely everything that can feasibly be done at all. It also means that as well as that mitigation, as huge mitigation efforts, we also need huge adaptation efforts, because as humanity we have left things so late, we have to also adapt to worsening conditions on many fronts, for every industry and every sector and every country. So this is why I just flagged this up. This is one particular organisation, this Global Commission on Adaptation. But adaptation is an aspect of climate change that is not understood and communicated as much as it needs to be. We need to both mitigate and adapt. And of course, we've all got a role to play in both. So, it wouldn't be complete talking about climate if we didn't also talk about the ecological crisis. So again, apologies, but as if it wasn't bad enough, we also need to bring in the ecology, because the climate and ecology are integrally connected. One impacts on the other. And whilst we've been burning enormous amounts of fossil fuels since the start of the Industrial Revolution, what we've also been doing is destroying habitat, deforesting, polluting, etc. And what that's led to is a biodiversity and ecosystem crisis, as well as a climate crisis. So alongside the United Nations IPCC report, there's also a United Nations body called the IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is a heck of a mouthful, but basically it's, again, large numbers of world-leading scientists, of biologists and ecologists and so on, and they pull together, just like the IPCC does, the consensus evidence on human impact on biodiversity and ecosystems. And their landmark report came out in May last year, and the headline was essentially, as it says there, that 1 million species are at risk of extinction in our lifetimes, which is mind-blowing to get one's head around. And whilst that is horrific in and of itself, it is also, of course, impacting on humanity, because that loss of life impacts on our ability to survive and the life support systems of the earth that we all depend on. That's a picture of deforestation and forest clearance in Indonesia, for example, probably for palm oil plantations or similar. So it's devastating to see, and it's devastating to understand the impact not on other species, and ultimately in the longer term and the bigger picture on human life. So a little bit more on biodiversity and our impact on animals around the world. So you may already be aware of this, but if we could imagine going back 10,000 years to the early part of the Holocene, before much of modern society or any modern society had really developed, almost all mammals were wild mammals on Earth, and very few were humans. We were much smaller numbers. And what we've done through particularly recent history is fundamentally altered the makeup of mammals on Earth. So now, as you can see from this picture, this chart, 60% of all mammals on Earth are actually the livestock that humans breed to consume the animal products, whether that's meat or dairy, etc. And humans ourselves are now 36% of all mammals, and wild mammals, you can see, are only 4%. So when we read those storybooks, those picture books to our children or our grandchildren or our nieces or our nephews or our friends' children, if we do, those storybooks about the animals in the ark or the animals in the wild or the etc. Unfortunately, it grieves me enormously to say that actually many of those animals either don't exist anymore, or are in such small numbers threatened with extinction, or they are what's called functionally extinct, where they don't exist in a population that's big enough to maintain itself in the longer term, or where their ecological niche and habitat is being destroyed and they don't have a long-term future on Earth. So where does that take us? Briefly, a little bit about oceans. We mustn't forget oceans. They're an incredibly important part of the picture. 7/10 of the Earth's surface is ocean, and we often don't give it enough thought. The chart here, I won't go into the technicalities of it, but basically it's showing increase in heat content of the oceans in the last 60, 70 years, which is absolutely enormous. So the oceans have done us an enormous service. Over 90% of the excess heat trapped in the atmosphere as a result of burning fossil fuels and increasing emissions, over 90% of that added temperature has been absorbed by the oceans. So the oceans have done us a great service, because if they hadn't have been there, we'd already have gone extinct, I think, or most life would have been, because the temperature would have increased so much already. So the oceans have done us an enormous service, but at the same time, they are really struggling. So warmer water, as you may remember from your school science, potentially can hold less oxygen than cooler water. So what that means is that it's one of the causes of dead zones developing in the ocean. So there are increasing large areas amongst the world's oceans that fewer and fewer species can survive in, if any. So that it's basically like wet deserts where there are very few species that can survive. In addition to getting warmer, oceans are also becoming more acidic because they're absorbing carbon dioxide. And what that carbon dioxide does is drive increase in acidity, which makes sea creatures with shells struggle to be able to build and regenerate their shells. So it is affecting all ocean life. Ecosystems are struggling. The warming water itself, together with chemicals and pollutants that we repeatedly pump into the oceans, are killing off enormous areas of the coral reefs, which you may be aware of, and it's predicted that by 1.5 degrees warming, we will lose 90% of coral reefs, and by 2 degrees warming, we'll lose 100% of coral reefs. And coral reefs are important in many ways, not least their beauty, but also the fact that they are the nursery breeding grounds for many aquatic species, some of which humans rely on for food in some parts of the world. And of course, melting ice caps and thermal expansion cause rising sea levels, which cause greater storm surges and coastal flooding, etc. Just a little bit more before we move on to what we can do about it. So I've mentioned a little bit about food and farming, but food farming and agriculture are huge issues. So in many ways, here we have an example of one of the world's bread baskets, which is the Midwest in the US, where they grow enormous amounts of corn and other foods, often for feeding to animals and livestock for people to eat the animals, as well as some human consumption. But this is a picture of some of the extreme weather and flooding they've had in the Midwest, where millions of hectares of land have been, where farmers have either been unable to plant crops or unable to harvest crops. And this is having big impacts of people either going out of business or having mental health problems, and suicide rates increasing, and so on. Biodiversity losses, and sorry for the sirens in the background, biodiversity losses and the way that we farm with massive monocultures, use of pesticides, destruction of natural habitats, and so on, lead us to destroying soil fertility. And in some parts of the world, there are soil fertility is rapidly decreasing, and is a big issue for the future of food production on Earth. It also means that our monocrops are at risk of pests, and we end up using more chemicals, which in turn are involved in killing insects and pollinators. So insect populations have absolutely crashed in many places on Earth. And of course, this is a huge issue because pollinators are responsible for pollinating many of our food sources. And in some parts of the Earth, humans are now paid to act as human pollinators because there aren't enough natural pollinators. And this is all in the context of obviously a growing population. I'm not going to talk a lot about population here. It's a complex issue, but what we do know is that people's desire for diets that involve meat and dairy increase demand for land use and increase emissions. So all of that, it drives up demand for land and drives up emissions and decreases biodiversity and increases habitat loss, etc. Food supply is a big issue. Food supply, there are increasing millions of people around the world in food insecurity. That's now increasing rather than decreasing globally. And food crops, this is an example of one report on agricultural yields around the world. Currently, global heating is causing some increases and some decreases for certain crops in some places globally. This is just one example of maize global production. But year on year, this analysis showed that global crop yield is reducing on average 1% a year at the moment. We don't have to look too far to know what unfortunately food shortages and starvation look like. So I'm going to pause there. I'm conscious I've thrown an awful lot of information at you, and you may have all sorts of questions. I'm conscious that you may be thinking and feeling a lot, and as I do every time I share this information with people. So I said just invite you to perhaps take a moment's reflection. If you have observations or questions you'd like to put in the chat, we could take a couple of those at this point, and then we'll move on to the what does it look like to potentially be a climate conscious coach, and what are some of the actions that we can take on this agenda. So I'll just pause for a moment's reflection and invite, if you want to for you to put any observations, reflections or questions in the chat. Okay. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat at this point, so given time I will continue. But, I just want to emphasize that it obviously, we know as coaches, it's we know ourselves well, and we reflect and we self-supervise, and hopefully we also get supervision, and we know that all sorts of emotions can come up in coaching conversations, and just as they can in coaching conversations, of course, all sorts of emotions can come up when we genuinely connect with the reality of what's happening on the planet, what's happening right now, and what's likely to continue, and what we need to do about it. So I guess I noticed that in myself. It always happens, and I don't think it'll ever stop. And I invite you to be open to those emotions in yourself, noticing what comes up, being open-hearted and compassionate and generous with yourself, connecting with those emotions and allowing them to come. They're real and they're important to acknowledge and to work with. And as and when we work with our clients on any of this stuff, which will only increase as time goes on, we need to connect with our own emotions. And part two, what can we do about this as climate conscious coaches? So coming back to my model and my 9 domains, which, as I said, I really developed to help myself think and work through this. We've, through what I've just outlined, begun to touch on the self piece. So educating and continuing to educate ourselves about the realities, the science, and what can be done about it. And so in this section, I'm going to just briefly touch on what are some of the questions that we can ask ourselves in relation to the other domains. So what action can we take in this whole spectrum of what it might be to be a climate conscious coach? So having touched on the first domain, we're going to just walk through these briefly. And as I said, there's more information, information on the model, and the questions are summarised in my article that came out in January, and there's a link there which I'm sure will be shared. I think there's a link on the EMCC resources page as well. So I will touch on these briefly, and then ask Natalia to help me shortly in seeing if there are any questions that you would like answered at the end of the session. So thinking about our own life, obviously, whether we are a coach or in a different profession or whatever, we have a footprint. We have a carbon footprint and an ecological footprint in our own life. So as individuals, what do you know? What do I know? What do we know about our impact and our carbon footprint and our ecological footprint? You may be familiar. There's lots of tools that we can use to do quick or in-depth measurements, and we can take action. So no different from any other adult or professional on the planet. We need to know what our impact is, and what can we do to reduce our impact, our own impact, to as near to net zero as possible. There are lots of things that individuals can do, and there are lots of things that individuals can't do, and we'll come on to that. But within the scope of where we can act, what are we doing to reduce our own impact as much as possible? So coming on to the third domain, I'm just going to touch on these briefly. Coming on to the third domain, our communities. That's really the opportunity to think about what are all the communities that we're part of. And this is where my own thinking took me in January last year. You know, where are all the interfaces that I have with communities, personally, professionally, as a parent, as a citizen, etc., etc. Where can I interface? Where can I seek to influence? Where can I try to change the conversation so that we can shift in the direction of travel we need to go and foster this great awareness and change in each of those communities? And all of us as coaches have communities that we're part of, obviously the coaching community, but there are also many, many other communities that we interface with. And then thinking about domain 4, as well as having a household, we also run a business, don't we? Many of us, not all of us, we might be internal coaches, but then the business organisation we're part of has a footprint. So our business and organisational footprint is relevant whether we are single-handed practitioners or run a bigger consultancy or our internal coaches or whatever. So what do we know about our own organisation's footprint, and what are we doing to reduce that to net zero as much as possible? What are we thinking about the impact, the actual impact of the way that we do business? And I just want to quickly flag this up. You may have seen this chart before, but it's a sobering and important one to highlight at this point when we're thinking about our own impact, because thinking about the 10% richest people on Earth, they're responsible for 49%. In other words, half of lifestyle consumption emissions are the responsibility of the 10% richest people. And actually, that 10% cutoff is a cutoff which probably includes most coaches, I have to say, and certainly most, if not all, of our clients. Is it something like £75,000 or $90,000 of capital in total in one's entire life puts one in the 10% top category. Whereas you can see the 50% poorest folk on Earth are only responsible for about 10% of emissions. So, you know, there is so much injustice in this work and in this understanding that those people who are being hit hardest are least well able to adapt and cope have had least responsibility for causing this. So I think it's really important that we hold this in our mind with ourselves and our clients in thinking about our responsibility to act. So moving on to domains 5 and 6, so political engagement. Again, I am not bringing this in as party political, but in the sense that, you know, we as coaches are adults, and therefore, you know, thanks to previous political action, we do have a vote in most countries around the world where we have democracy of some sort or other. So, you know, how aware are we as individuals of the different policies of political parties at a local or a national level, and how much do we consider these factors in the way that we vote? That is an aspect that it's important to think about in I would say, in every election. And our practice itself, so from, you know, domain 6 onwards, we're thinking for me about particularly our actual coaching practice. So domain 6, thinking about actually how can we bring this climate reality into the field in our coaching practice. And there is lots of debate about actually, is that influencing our clients' agenda and inputting our own agenda? I categorically disagree with that, because I don't think I fundamentally believe that everything I've described in terms of the science is not an agenda. It's just the reality. It's the physics. You know, we're breathing in air that's got 415, 416 parts per million CO2 in it, and so are our clients, and so are all their customers. So this is just bringing reality into awareness. And isn't that what coaches do? You know, we challenge and we bring things into awareness, and we support and challenge our clients to do that. So thinking about what are all the ways in which we can bring this awareness into the coaching conversations, into the room, in a way that, you know, is non-judgmental and non-blaming, because we're all part of this system and we've all been brought up in this system. And how can we bring this into all of our coaching conversations? There are lots of ways to do that, by the way, and some of our subsequent webinars 2, 3, 4 and 5 are all going to bring in different ways the practicalities of thinking and acting as a coach in this sphere. We're going to get much more practical and crunchy about how do we do this in the subsequent webinars. So moving on to the remaining domains, so our ethics. There's here, of course, there's questions about, you know, once we know, how do we act once we knew, and once we know this stuff, how does having a greater awareness of the climate and ecological crisis impact on our decisions, on the whole myriad of decisions that we make as a coach? You know, who we choose to work with, who we don't choose to work with, the way that we work with those clients, the way that we develop our coaching businesses, our niches, our coaching careers. You know, this is the context for everything for the rest of our lives now. I can't stress that enough. This is everything, everywhere, forever. So it needs to, you know, creep in, and more than creep into everything that we do. And of course, our own reflection and supervision is also relevant here. How do we bring this dimension or these dimensions into our own reflective practice, in our self-supervision, our self-reflection? How do we bring this to our supervision? What do we want of our supervisors in supporting us and challenging us in this area? How equipped are our supervisors to do that? And if we are a supervisor ourselves, how are we bringing this into our practice? I am not sitting here saying I've got all the answers to all of these questions. I'm on the journey like everyone else. And then finally, in terms of the last domain, domain 9, supporting adaptation. So I've alluded to this really briefly, that because we've left this all so late as a species, you know, we have to do an awful lot of adaptation for years and decades to come, as well as mitigation. And that's, we have to accept that with all the practical and emotional and societal implications. And increasingly, that is going to be part of coaching conversations. Clients will be bringing things that are in the adaptation agenda, whether they're aware of it or not. And it has a myriad impacts from, you know, societally, emotionally, practically, in business terms, in hard economic terms, etc. I think I really wanted to bring my piece to a close with an image of the next generation. This is an image of the climate strike last Friday in Bristol, a different part of the country from where I am, but 30,000 young people and adults went to the climate strike in Bristol, in part to hear Greta Thunberg speak. But I thought this was a pretty powerful image, and you know, I hope that you will also feel that we have a responsibility to act as professionals in every way that we can to support not just ourselves, but also our clients and the next generations coming after us. So thank you for your attention, for your time, for your presence. My contact details are there, and you can contact me on email or via LinkedIn or Twitter, and I will be very, very happy to connect with you. And I would definitely recommend following up this webinar with subsequent ones, which are going to be more conversational, more engaging and more practical, to enable us to all think together about actually what are the different ways that we can respond to this reality. So at this point I will stop talking and stop my slide share and see if Natalia wants to come in with some questions from the chat.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Zoe, for what you've been doing for the last hour and a half. I have a couple of questions. A bit of it you've already covered. I think the last one that has come in is worth flagging, in that Lucy is wondering that 5 months is a long time for us to wait to hear all about these. You know, in a way, she's wondering if we can make it quicker. I had a quick reaction on that, which is twofold. One is, we want to give everyone the opportunity to reflect and let all of this sink in, and also give the topic the length and the continuity it deserves. Insofar, we don't want to run this in a couple of weeks, we're done, you know, like that, we move on. Really, the context behind this with Zoe and colleagues was, you know, let's give everybody the opportunity to contextualize practice. As so we mentioned, future sessions are going to focus on the practicalities of how to, and actually come back perhaps with questions and reflections. That's why we're giving it the length, not implying that it's the end of this, but to give it a natural life. I don't know if you want to add anything on that, Zoe.
I think that's a really good point, Natalia. I guess, yeah, we could have sort of crunched them all together, say every couple of weeks or something. But I think it. There were a number of reasons, as you say, that actually we wanted a series of injections, if you like. But I think I hear people's urgency, and it's probably a good time to actually highlight some of the other resources, because there's lots that people can be doing and thinking about and acting on in the short term before we have the future webinars. I hope that today this session has prompted some thought and some reflection that you could take to peer supervision, or take to your clients, or explore ways in which you can begin to do this. But I would also highlight a couple of things specifically. Some of you may be aware there's a Climate Coaching Action Day that is going on globally tomorrow. So very short notice, but it's tomorrow. And there's various things happening with different organisations and so on. But one of the big things happening is the 24-hour global coaching conversation, coaching and climate, that's being supported by all the major professional bodies, and has been put on by a new entity called the Climate Coaching Alliance, the CCA. So directly, a couple of things people could do if they wanted to from this is join the CCA, the Climate Coaching Alliance. If you look it up online, there's a you can join that by leaving your details, and it's going to be an increasing source of information, cross profession information for all coaches and related professionals involved in this collective endeavour. And there's the Climate Coaching Action Day taking place tomorrow, which is a 24-hour endeavour where people can dial in from any point in the globe at any time zone. Do you want to say any more about that, Natalia?
I would just one comment in that a colleague has just come back saying, perhaps we could record this and give everybody the opportunity to watch at their own pace, which is a good idea. But really, other than this one being Zoe setting up the context with the facts, the figures, the science, all the others really are far more intended to be interactive. So we just don't want you to watch a video as you can watch a TV program. This is much more of the interaction and bringing this to the reality of your coaching and supervision practice. That is why we set this up. However, feel free to email us any questions, further comments. We're going to try to adapt. I mean, through the website, we've already mentioned there's a lot of resource uploaded already in terms of reading materials, blogs, articles. Zoe kindly provided other video links to other things. And one of the things, for instance, that we have now prepared will be released in the next couple of weeks, for instance, is a commentary or a review of a book chapter that Peter Hawkins and Eve Turner have done in the book about systemic coaching. They address these matters. So we, by the way, I should say as a little disclaimer, we're not endorsing books like as such as EMCC UK. What we do is we offer these as a discounted resources if you check the website. But I just wanted to flag that what I'm mentioning is this book where Eve is addressing these matters, and more resources are going to come available in between webinars. So I think probably that's what I have to say on this one, but by all means, contact us with your comments.
Thank you, Natalia. Yes. I'm just looking at some of the other questions, see if we can pick any of those out. Someone's asking, can we get information written about the Climate Coaching Action Day? I think it's on the Climate Coaching Alliance. So if people just search, on search engine, Climate Coaching Alliance, then the information will be able to be linked through from there. It's also all over LinkedIn. If you follow either myself on LinkedIn, or Peter Hawkins, who's involved, or Eve Turner, who's involved, or Alison Whybrow, or Josie McLean. And someone's just, Sarah Loud, thank you, Sarah. You just pasted in a link to the Climate Coaching Alliance into the chat. So that's the direct link to Climate Coaching Alliance, and you'll be able to not only sign up to the CCA there, but also find information about the 24-hour event tomorrow. There are, as Natalia's always also referred to, on the EMCC UK website, there's a direct link to a list of resources, all sorts of links and other resources on there as well, with other articles that you can look at as well from myself, but also with other people, not just me. What else? I've seen there's some practical questions about how, where are we? How do we bring this to our clients? So I think I would say that I'm conscious we only have a couple of minutes to go, but I'm not going to get into the depths of that now because we will cover that in our future sessions. But I would encourage you to experiment, and I would encourage you to bring up this conversation with your fellow coaches in your local chapters or groups or peer supervisions or whatever, and just talk about it. You know, one of the first things we need to do to tackle this agenda is talking about it and bringing it you know, out of the too difficult box or too awkward to talk about box into our conversations. And just experimenting. You know, I've been experimenting for over a year now, bringing it more explicitly into my coaching conversations, and it's taken me to all sorts of places. And I'd invite you to do the same in a whole myriad of ways, as well as thinking about all the different parts of that model, You know, if the model doesn't work for you, that's fine, but I hope that those different domains support you to reflect and think about all the ways in which we can have an impact as coaches.
So mindful of time, can I just tell everyone a big thank you for joining us, and then flag the next 4 webinars, which will be going on the EMCC website to sign up. We're just waiting for one date to be able to publish those. So in April, we'll see Peter Hawkins. In May, we'll see Charly Cox and Zoe again. Then we'll see Linda Aspey and Alison Whybrow. So we're really looking forward to this series of webinars. You'll have the chance to sign up as a series if you're interested, and there will be interactive. We hope to encourage you to participate. And all that is left for me to say is a huge thank you to Zoe for your time, your wisdom, and for the opportunity to have this as a resource in EMCC UK. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you everyone for joining us. I really appreciate it.